Alrighty, so let's. Yeah, if I find my cursor again. All right, here we go.
Okay, just so I can kind of get these design points here. Okay, I started working on this in December as part of the initiative to have an alternative to JSON.NET and other serializers for high performance and leveraging the span stuff, etc. But we want to get this in 3.0, and there's a huge number of features that people ask for regarding serializers and deserializers. So the idea is to do a minimum version, kind of test the waters on this, make sure it's fast, make sure it's designed for performance first, and supports async and these high-level design goals, and then add functionality once we get that in. So there's all kinds of feature requests that have came in that I gathered some and put them in like a to-do section or pending section, but in general, I want to try to keep this meeting just talking about the APIs I show here and not, feature asks. If that even comes up, it might not. So other constraints, yeah, POCO objects, primarily used for DTO, data transfer scenarios. This basically means, complex inheritance structures and having references between objects and things like that aren't supported. So it's basically you have your object, you have collections, and those can contain collections or primitives or other objects, etc. in a composition layer, not associations to other objects and things like that. Okay, API is designed to be extensible. So what this means is that partially because of feature asks, and partially because we don't know all of the requirements in edge cases. There's certain plug points for handling enums, handling dates, that sort of thing, that we know we can't ship every possible way to serialize and deserialize dates. So there's certain extension points covered here that others can extend themselves, and we will provide default implementations. Fourth bullet, use attributes. Use design time attributes, but still support runtime changes to those attributes or specifying the attributes at runtime. And the last bullet is just talking about high performance, using IL emit with fallback for standard reflection for compatibility with platforms that don't support IL emit. Okay, any questions on that?
I have two questions. This is Rich. One is, and this probably, I briefly looked at the rest of the document, so maybe this is covered, but are you going to support any existing attributes or just create new ones? And then the second question is, at some point, either now or later in a later release, will you support build time code gen instead of just runtime code gen?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, those are good questions. Okay. So the first one, supporting existing attributes. Yeah, the system XML namespace does have some attributes that we could, reuse. The problem is that the main attribute that you can, for example, specify property name, like if you want to change a property name, also has like 5 other properties on it that don't all make sense here. There's other interfaces like deserialization callback and stuff that do, however, make sense once we get to that. But currently, I'm not reusing any attributes, mainly because they don't fit in 100%. And so that does mean that, for example, if you have a class that uses these other serializers, you may have to add another attribute or something if you want to reuse serializers. If people do that anyway, I don't know. And the other question, support build-time code gen. Yeah, I mean that is something that is actually probably necessary if you ever want to get decent perf on platforms that don't support IO emit, AOT scenarios. And so yeah, I mean that honestly I think is a required feature, but it's just a scoping decision right now that until we get the core functionality in, using IL emit and using reflection and that sort of thing. And actually, that also ties in with the extensibility model, which I'll talk about a little bit if we have time at the end. And it's the ability to say, hey, I have I have 50 classes or 50 types in a graph here, and I want to serialize them. And 49 work fine, one doesn't. I just need to go in and hook up this weird array or something like that. And that code that you end up writing, I hope in the end is going to be similar to or the same as what we have for build-time code gen. So when I get to the extensibility feature, it'll kind of tie into that as well. That that the APIs and the mechanism that you would do that hopefully would be the same as what we generate for build time.
So if we had build time code gen, would there be a possibility to bridge? So say there was a library that used existing attributes. With code gen, could we bridge to respecting those in some way in the future? Or no?
I'm not sure. We can do anything, but I'm not sure what you're trying to achieve, I guess. So
well, so one of the things I was curious about is there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of libraries on NuGet.org that are decorated with existing attributes, and it'd be great if those could be used with this new serializer, deserializer without being changed.
Hey, Rich, how does that affect the APIs here?
Well, it doesn't really affect the APIs as much as the implementation, because it's really point 4.
I guess if you talk about API, right, I think one way I could see this being done is similar how Math v2 worked, right? Math v1 was attribute based, and then you had a very complicated extensibility model for that. Math v2 was more around you have a configuration builder where you can effectively configure what conventions you want to use, right? And you can chain attributes, you can chain naming conventions, and we could do something similar here. I think I think to me it's less about the attributes, because the problem usually with serialization is that it's not just the attribute, right? It's the kind of shape that the serializer can handle. So, for example, can it do graphs, or can it only do trees? Can it handle read-only properties when the constructor has equally named arguments, right? And those are not necessarily an expression of attributes, right? Those are a convention between the serializer and the types you can serialize, right? And I think that's why I think if our goal is to bring up existing libraries, then I think to Steve's earlier point, I think that will be a non-so-trivial undertaking, right? If you look at JSON.NET, for example, it will handle even immutable types, right? It will even handle cases where you have completely read-only, properties and only constructors or factory methods, and it will go out of its way to discover those. The problem is that all of these things are, work that you have to do at runtime potentially as well, if you want to support that as well. And then, you basically have competing requirements now, whether you want to do performance or whether you want to do something that is super versatile. I think the goal for our serializer here is more towards the, design your types for our API service, meaning have simple POCOs, and then we will work just fine. But if you try to retrofit something existing, then I think in V1 that might not be supported at all.
Yeah, well, I think one of my most basic questions is, could we make anything with some definition of anything work if we had build time code gen, such that performance trade-offs were less acute in nature?
I think, if our goal would only be performance, then I think that's probably a fair statement. And as I said, like the way I can see this being done is with a configuration or convention builder where you can register what conventions you have, and then we either activate it at runtime with ref emit, or we do design time code split, right? I think the problem with these kind of things is more, can you describe what these rules are in a way that we can reason about them, right? Because the other problem that we have with serialization is that almost all technologies we have that do it are extremely complicated, extremely fragile, and the problem usually is why people want to have more complicated serialization rules is because they have already an existing object model or existing set of types, and they try to retrofit serialization on top of that. And the problem with that approach is that it's very hard for us to not break them in the future when they version their types, or they're looping in one of our types, and then we version our type, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think the general guideline for serialization is just have very simple types, and if you want to have anything more fancy, do it on top, so serialization becomes easy to reason about.
Yeah, I'll just say two more things, and then I'll stop. One is I don't think we can reason about this design until we see a statement that says X%. We expect X percentage of JSON.NET users to move to this API, because if it was 90%, it requires a certain level of usability. If it's 10%, then it's a different one. And then the other part is I'd love to see. There's a bunch of examples in this document. I'd love to see the analogous JSON.NET syntax for that exact thing. I know we're not trying to create like I don't think migration is really the goal here. So it's not like the code has to look the same, but I think the usability of one code sample versus another is super germane to this this API and to this review in particular.
Okay, and we are working on a migration document.
Sure, but that's what I just said. I don't care about that. That's not why I said those things.
Yeah, it's just about migration, more about compare and contrast with, to get a sense for usability, right? I think that's fair.
Exactly. Yeah. But I'd still like this statement in this document about the percent of users that you expect to move as a goal.
Yeah.
I want to echo a little bit of what Rich is saying there. From the ASP.NET point of view, and specifically from the point of view of like people building REST APIs with ASP.NET, ultimately success looks like to us, some high percentage of users are happy with the built-in serializer and are even happier with the built-in serializer because of better performance and things like that. So it's kind of like from the ASP.NET point of view, that's almost entirely to do with the attributes and how you configure serializer in different settings and things like that, because it serialize things in the way that you expect and all those kind of details, more so than the actual APIs, because our users don't interact with them that often. Now I can't necessarily put a number on that. We're sort of invested in the success of this as much as you guys are, so we kind of want things to get to the point where we would make this the default, and then take user feedback and let that direct, what our next steps are.
Yeah, and like I mentioned early on here that, okay, right now I'm the only one working on this, and I started in December, and, when we talked to James Newton, it took him, 12 years and 12 releases to get to where he is now, right? And dozens of features, and we don't expect anywhere near 90%, my opinion. Okay, so I don't know what the percentage is going to be, but if the bulk, and it's complicated, we'd have to probably get him involved to figure out which of the dozens of features that are supported apply here, and anyway, so there's this matrix maybe that we can end up doing to get that number. But first of all, that number is not going to be easy. And second, we never stated, and we don't want to support 100% of the features. There's a lot of overhead associated with some of those features. So I don't think we should strive for 90 or 100% necessarily. And
I think you're kind of missing the point, though.
Well, okay, let me finish this thought, though. And the other point about this is that, let's say we hit 30%, okay, which is low, that we might decide not to ship this for 3.0, and we might want to hold it as a technical preview or something along those lines for ASP.NET. Okay.
Well, I think you changed the metric halfway through, which is why I said I think you're missing the point. It wasn't about features, a percentage of features implemented. It's more about new ASP.NET Core users and potentially their apps as a metric.
Yeah, I think,
and it's also not about V1.0. It's about what do we strive to hit in some reasonable time frame. Maybe that reasonable time frame is 5 years. I don't know. But
yeah, I think to your other point though, like I think if we rephrase this thing, what's the percentage of customers that would be happy with the built-in JSON serialization? I think that's a more interesting question, right? Because as Steve said, like if we really want to replace all of JSON.NET usage in some reasonable time frame, and even if that's 5 years, that effectively means we have to subsume 100% of what JSON.NET has, which I think would be impossible unless we literally rebuild it. At which point, I think whatever we would be building would not be better, right? It would share the same characteristic and probably would be worse because it's something new. But I think if we just say, well, assuming net new customers would move to ASP.NET Core and they would write their types, would they be successful with the built-in serialization that we offer, or would they immediately fall off the cliff and have to basically loop in JSON.NET or something else? And I think that percentage should be fairly high because the idea is, well, unless we do something completely stupid in our serialization, they should be able to write reasonable apps with reasonable effort. And even if if what they have to do is different from JSON.NET, so long it's still easy and it's still a bit of success and high performance, then I think that would be okay. And so I think from that point of view, that percentage should be very close to 80-90%, right? I think if we go here for 40% or 30%, then we basically build something that we don't think is good for our customer base. It will be very niche at that point, which it still might be worthwhile doing, but at that point we're no longer shooting for that's the default experience in ASP.NET, which is I think still what we want to do.
Okay, I guess my only comment was I assume, Rich, that you were referring to the 3.0 release when you said that. So, and I didn't catch the ASP.NET only users.
well, I wasn't trying to say that we only care about ASP.NET users. Far from that. But I agreed mostly with the wording that Emo just said, because as we go through this review, I think there'll be a lot of like no, we can't do this because it's intended to be a high performance system. Well, it would be good to clarify if when we say those things, if we believe that's necessary to hit these high adoption numbers for ASP.NET Core, and if like something like build time code gen would be a mitigation for that, things like that. But I agreed mostly with what Evo said.
Okay, let's move on. Prototype, yeah, there is a prototype. Oh, here's the macro. Okay, there is a prototype in CoreFX Lab. It has the implementation of 90% of the stuff talked about in here. Say some of the names are different. For example, JSON converter options is called JSON converter settings. Anyway, so doesn't necessarily align with what I have here, but it's pretty close. Okay, so the API. So let's just start at the very top. And Rich, I mean, it might be good. I mean, if you're not familiar with JSON.NET, it would be nice maybe to have an intro if that's our main, target. The way we want to approach explaining the APIs is to compare and contrast. But every serializer seems to have a slightly different interface for the very front. And I took approach here of just a static class with the options type that you have to pass in. And so scroll down a little bit. So it's called JSON Converter. It is similar to some of the JSON.NET JSON Converter classes for primitive types. But in either case, it's JSON Converter, not JSON Serialization or something like that. And it's in the system text JSON Serialization namespace, which is a sub namespace of the reader and writer. These are just all from and to methods. There's 5 primary objects that we convert to and from, and one is a span, another is a sequence, another one's a pipe reader or writer, and then a stream, and then a string. And the spans and sequence are based off of bytes, and so is the pipe reader and pipe stream. But the string ones are a little special, that we kind of help convert from UTF-8 to UTF-16. We might add some more methods here for UTF-8 string, but the main API is in front of you. I could walk through each of these. Honestly, I think they're pretty self-explanatory. There's generic versions and then there's non-generic versions. Span and sequence have different usage scenario sequence. You can have multiple byte arrays basically, and they're chained together. Span is the new, ref struct that for performance, we use internally quite a bit. So that's the preferred API if you have that.
So I have a quick question on those span APIs. You have a toJSON API that returns span of bytes. Where does that span come from?
Let me see. You mean the object that you pass in?
No, so the object that you pass in is the object that you want to be serialized, correct? I'm looking at the toJSON that takes object value and returns a span of byte.
Yeah, so that's the return JSON.
Yeah, but so that span of byte has to be backed by something, right? Like it has to be backed by an array or something else.
Yeah. It is backed, by an array.
So that should return the array.
Okay.
Yeah.
We only return span if it's a span of input data.
Okay, I'll note that.
I mean, it could return a memory of byte if we were doing something with memory allocation under the covers where we may have allocated a larger array than we actually needed. If you return an array, then presumably you need to shrink it. If you returned a memory of byte, you wouldn't have to.
Okay, I noted that.
Right. So as one example, for instance, is maybe if you had an overload which allowed the user to pass in an array pool, then maybe you could return the byte array along with an out. Here's the length of the data that I wrote to the byte array. That way the user, like the caller, can be fully responsible for all allocations. So you can still have an allocation-free API if you really wanted.
That return type would be array segment, but yes.
Yeah, sure.
But also,
so Steve, why are most of these extension methods?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know which way the wind is blowing on these. Do people prefer extension methods or not? I added extension methods here, but depending upon how people feel about it, I will remove them. And I keep them here for.
I would generally say I don't think we should have extension methods on super generic types. Like I think, for example, you have some APIs that take object, right? We really don't want a toJSON extension method hanging off of object, but they also didn't make them extension method. But I think the same can be said for stream or read-only sequence, right? I think for those things you really want static methods. Otherwise, it will be a bit weird if you have these super generic types that have fairly specific APIs on them now. And we
okay, that's fine. I mean, if that's the consensus or majority, I'm okay with that. A lot of the other serializers have these, so including things on like the first string. So.
Yeah,
they don't go through our API reviews.
So Stephen Tobe, like I have a question generally on the pattern. Like when we say you pass in the read-only, the span of byte that we write into. Doesn't the API also have to effectively have some sort of notion for how many bytes were, written or read in error cases?
Well, for writing, you certainly would need an out that says how many bytes you read, but I don't see any cases here where you're passing in a writable span. Am I missing it?
Well, there would be the toJSON one once you pass in the span of byte that you want to fill, right?
But we don't have that right now. I mean,
yeah. And then for the from case, I mean, it depends on what you're trying to support. We have a lot of APIs that just assume that the span you're passing in either represents the whole piece, or you're not going to be trying to parse what comes after whatever you ended up parsing out of it. So you don't need to know how many things it read from it. If that's not the case here, if the span might contain the JSON for an object and then something else, yeah, you would need to have an out parameter that indicated how many bytes were read. So it depends on the scenario. Like for example, int.parse that takes a read-only span of char. It doesn't tell you how many characters it read from the input span because it assumes the whole thing is the integer. In contrast, UTF-8 parser takes a span and an out int so that it can, because it doesn't assume the whole input is the thing to be parsed, so it tells you how much of it was.
Yeah, where did we land on this on our JSON APIs? I think our JSON APIs that we have right now also assume that the entire data is JSON and we barf when there's follow-up stuff, right?
JSON document assumes that the data it's given is one single complete JSON value. The JSON reader is low level enough that you can do with it whatever you want.
Well, that's a good question. Right now we do ignore errors if you have extra data at the end of your whatever you pass in. So
If you're not returning the out, you need to throw.
yeah, and JSONNet has a flag. You can specify whether you want to throw or not, and we don't have that flag. But throw by default seems probably the right thing to do. So I can do that. But that's not really visible in the API right now. I mean,
No, but
you don't know whether it's going to throw or not.
Right.
What are the bottom two? The bottom thing which says to JSON sync, I assume is async. Their value task with no return type.
Yeah, because they write to the writer or the stream. They return a value task, and, which is just like task without a T, right?
Fair enough.
A struct and a little, but it's a struct. I mean, that's kind of the preferred model if you don't have a T. I think the preference is right now to use value task instead of plain task.
Well, not necessarily.
Yeah, the rules are more complicated than that. I know.
And in this case, I'm not sure it makes sense. So the only value to the only let me use my words more carefully. The only benefit to using a value task in this situation is if we believed that to JSON async or to JSON sync, or is that a typo? I guess they're both to JSON
Sorry,
async.
yeah, that's a typo.
If we believe that to JSON async would be able to return a value task that wrapped an iValue task source. So if to JSON async was implementing an iValue task source interface and returning a value task that wrapped that, rather than just wrapping the value task around a task, it would do that if, for example, it was able to pool the iValue task source objects, and if doing so yielded a perf benefit from not having to allocate that additional, say, 70 byte object for each call to JSON async. My guess is there's enough other allocation happening here that one allocation wouldn't matter, and it's a difficult allocation to avoid. I mean, today you wouldn't be able to use an async method to implement this, because it's going to, an async method is going to have an allocation. Either it's going to complete synchronously, in which case it doesn't matter, or it's going to complete asynchronously, in which case the task that it returns is the state machine that was boxed to the heap, or quote boxed to the heap, and so you already have that allocation anyway. In which case this should just return task rather than value task.
And then now I'm like, so I understand the object returning an array called toJSON, but the ones that are writing to writers, I feel like those should be write JSON instead of toJSON. Because the purpose of the method is the side effect. That's why you don't have a return type. So we need the verb to indicate what the side effect is.
Any other comments on that? Right, instead of to for the async.
Sounds reasonable.
I'm not sure if I think that the writer should go first or second.
What about from the from? Do you think those should be read instead of from?
So I will act as a foil here, because at our last API review, we actually said that any type that has convert or converter in the name, like that is the verb. So there's no need to put an additional verb on the method names.
Fair enough.
You mean versus like read? All right, or
yeah, because we have an actual convert class in the.
Yeah, I mean, so it's like convert from JSON, convert to JSON, convert. Yeah. So convert, right? Yeah.
So I'm having a little trouble following. Are we saying we like JSON converter or JSON convert
Well,
best?
well, okay, I think that might be separate. Is okay, whether it's converter, since it's already, has convert in the name, does JSON converter dot to JSON async sound better than JSON converter dot write JSON async? Because you're writing, you're not really returning the JSON. But your other question about converter, yeah, maybe we'll table that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think write looks better. It indicates what's going on and why there's not a return value. But if we've already had precedent recently, then we should follow that.
Honestly, I would just model it off of the existing type, which is we have this convert class with the static helpers, right? Convert to in32. I don't know, JSON convert to JSON seems reasonable, but we could also go with something that has serialization in the name and then just, nuke the namespace, because I don't think we will have that many types in the namespace anyway.
Right,
There are a lot of types in the namespace.
Convert to int32 is returning an int32. Like my comment about two versus right here is that it's not returning JSON. It caused JSON to be written into a stream. So the purpose of this method is a side effect, not a return value.
Okay, yeah, that's a point well taken.
So Steve, you said there will be a lot of types. I mean, how many types do you foresee being in the namespace? Right now I see 2. Is there more than that?
Presumably the attribute model.
Yeah, right now there's 2 sub namespaces right now. One for what we call policies, and then one for converters. And normally, normal users don't see those. But yeah, all of the other attributes that you'd want to place on your type would be in the same namespace. So in the end, maybe a dozen, to 2 dozen at the max, I think.
Okay, yeah, if that's the case, then I think having a separate namespace makes total sense. But,
And it also just blew the namespace quite a bit, because the reader and writer are in there. So
yeah,
okay, let's try to catch up, or I'll try to catch up to the discussion now. Are we saying that there's the write JSON or write JSON async is and probably read then, right, is preferred over the to and the from?
I think generally like to and like if you go with the convert model, right, where we have convert to in32 or something like that, I think generally like operations you think that are somewhat smallish, right? Anything that may read a bunch of stuff, walk an entire object graph or something. The to and from seems a bit misleading because it makes the operations sound much cheaper than they actually are, right? I think for anything that does things, in a loop or something, you would expect like a write or a read method name, I think.
Okay, and then there was previous feedback that said if you have converter in the name, you don't need another verb.
Yeah, which is why maybe JSON converter is not the right model here.
Should we also keep deserialize, serialize in the mix instead of having to from?
Well, it depends what that top level class name is, though, I think, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to have serialization dot serialize to. I think that'd become kind of goofy, but my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That seems redundant at that point.
JSON serializer.read JSON, JSON serializer.write JSON, those both seem like natural sentences. JSON serializer from JSON when you already have contained data is fine, or it could be write JSON just to match the other overloads. Sorry, from JSON would be read JSON. So the to and from I'm fine with on when it's either the bytes in or the bytes out. The one where it's the side effect nature, I feel that the read verb should be there and the write verb.
Yeah, I would. Maybe we should do something like JSON serializer dot read, JSON serializer dot write.
Yeah, those seem fine to me. And the byte overloads, those are fine with the read and write verbs as well. Just to and from on the side effects is weird to me.
Yeah.
So to and fro, okay, so let me recap then. Jeremy, that's Jeremy, right?
Yep.
Okay, so JSON serializer, static class, and then use read and write for everything except for the ones that take these byte arrays or some future methods that we don't have yet.
I mean,
No, for everything.
Yeah, the easiest model and the most overload producing and lowest concept is just change all froms to reads and all twos to writes.
Okay. Because you did say something like if you have something small, then the to and the from might make more sense.
Yeah, well, on the ones that are operating on the span of like the reads from spans and sequences of bytes, I don't object to the word from on that one, but once we have the reads on the other ones, making overloads seems better. So from is fine for the bytes, but read matches what the rest of the overloads will be.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody have any other comments on that? I mean, I'm open to it. This, like I said, everyone has a slightly different API version, and
Yeah, what I like about read and write in general is that it kind of is consistent with the rest of the APIs we now have in the JSON namespace, and they're also both short. And so if we have to support other shapes like the JSON string example or the async ones, then we still have plenty of space to suffix the name with something reasonable without creating absurd API names.
do we want to keep the JSON portion in it, or just read and write sufficient?
I would just go with read and write because these are static methods, right? You invoke them on JSON serializer dot read, JSON serializer dot write. I mean, at that point, it's clear what it does.
And I think the string versions are that way because the from versions collided with another method. So like the span version. So I think the string methods might still need string on them, but
The string isn't implicitly convertible to span of byte, so JSON.
I think maybe because of extension methods. If they are no longer extension methods, you might be get away with the overload resolution.
no, well, okay. I mean, they have different return values, but let me look at that. 2 JSON string, 2 JSON.
Yeah, the right one. So the one that's producing a string, that one might still need to be 2 JSON string.
Yeah, and the other ones I for consistency with the 2 JSON string, I just added the from JSON. I mean the string to the from.
Yeah,
but if we decide that 2 JSON will accept input span, so then you can overload it to fine.
Well, the problem with the 2 JSON writing to a span, whether it be span of byte or span of char, is you have probably no good way of guessing how big the output will be. So it's going to be a very bad retry pattern.
If they end up colliding on signature, I'll add string. If they don't, I'll remove the string.
Sounds good.
But right now, I'm going to keep the rough API, except for what we talked about with the naming and the typo on 2 JSON sync. Yeah.
So
okay.
I wanted to discuss that very first method real fast, the one that takes a read-only span of byte as input. That's the only method that that takes a ref struct as input, and I wonder if that's going to hamper our ability to generate state parameters or something else if we're going to have this like rich attribute model for controlling serialization. Does that kind of make sense as a concern?
No.
So we know that the places where you can use ref structs like read-only span are very limited, right? We know that you can't have them as a field in a regular struct and so on. And I wonder if having if that very particular API, that very particular one that takes a read-only span of byte, is going to prohibit us from introducing APIs in the future that require things like state objects for controlling how various properties are serialized and deserialized. Imagine something like data annotations. Like, are we going to be able to use something like that given the fact that this is a ref struct? Like, how are we going to actually pass those values over to such a system?
So are you proposing, so what would you do to avoid that? I mean,
well, I was wondering if maybe we
Static
actually need to
method,
make that
you don't
read-only memory.
to call it, okay.
I don't know. I wanted other feedback on this. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but I'm thinking that this might hamper the ability to make future changes.
If we have a problem when we add new features, then that feature would be the only one that couldn't take the span, and I think that would be a deferred to the future. But from the functional model, all that you need is a projection of where the memory lives to produce the output. So span is the API shape for the right input type.
Right, well, technically, you could make the same argument with something like regex, but regex is so insanely complicated under the covers that we couldn't plumb read-only span and byte through it.
But
and I'm wondering if that will happen here.
Class.
Yes.
This is a static method. There's no state. If there is state, you're not allowed to know about it. So from the API shape, read-only span is the correct answer.
And your ASN1 parser as well, even though it's even though some of those methods are static.
The ASN1 parser is stateful, so it takes memory in the constructor.
Okay.
That's the difference. Okay. This is it's not a function; it's an object. This is a function.
Okay. Sure.
Okay, and I have one question for Stephen Taub on ValueTask versus task. Before I move on to the next section, what was your summary of, should we be using ValueTask or tasks for this particular?
For the two JSON async?
Yes.
My default would be task unless you can prove to me otherwise. And you could prove to me otherwise if you could tell me that A, two JSON async is going to do very little allocation. B, it would be able to implement iValueTask source as a backing for ValueTask and pool it appropriately. So that, which is how you would avoid any allocation associated or amortized allocation associated with these calls. Otherwise, if you just return task, if two JSON async happens to return synchronously, then there's going to be no allocation. And if it completes asynchronously and you were implementing it using an async method, you're still only going to get the one allocation on .NET Core, the one allocation associated with the state machine, which also doubles as the task.
Okay, well then it sounds like it should be task.
I have a question. For the
sorry, can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah, go ahead.
The more interesting question for me would be the from JSON async rather than the to JSON async. There would be value in from JSON async returning ValueTask of T and ValueTask of object, more value, if we believe it would be common for those to complete synchronously. Because if they complete synchronously, then this will almost certainly allocate a task where with ValueTask of T it wouldn't be necessary. So that case is a little easier to argue for ValueTask. If we believe it'll be common for those to complete synchronously, ValueTask might be worthwhile.
Is there some kind of guidance on using task versus ValueTask?
Yes. 1 second.
And as far as net standard goes, using there, you can use the two interchangeably.
Task is in every net standard implementation. ValueTask is available for every net standard implementation. Well, down to like 1.1 or something. but it's in .NET Core and it's available out of band for framework and the other net standards,
including task or value task of T. That's there as well.
Yes.
Okay.
And I just pasted into the chat window a blog that'd be worth reading.
Okay. Yeah, because this comes up every single time there's an async method being reviewed. So seems like at least the ones I listen to.
So Stephen, is there like an easy rule of thumb?
Yeah. It's a few steps, but if you are a chunky method, you're likely to complete asynchronously. You're going to be using async methods to implement it. You want the most usability. Default to returning task of T. Like that's sort of the default. Choose those. Then the question is, when would you potentially switch? It's a little bit more clear cut if you're returning a value. So if you're returning a T, then if you are likely to complete synchronously, and if allocation is important to you, there's a good chance you want to return a value task of T instead of a task of T. And that's because when you complete synchronously with a task of T, you're probably going to allocate. And with a value task of T, you're probably not, or you're not. If you're not returning a T, basically if you're the async equivalent of void, so you'd be returning task or value task, the only benefit to returning value task over task is if you would internally do this very complicated thing using iValue task source, and you wouldn't be using async methods to implement it and so on. So we do that in a few specialized cases. We do that in socket, read async, write async, so that the socket can cache and reuse its iValue task source over and over and over and over again. We do that in pipelines for a similar reason. We do that in channels for a similar reason. Basically, these super high throughput APIs where allocations are critical. And you're doing these, hundreds of thousands of times a second, and you wouldn't want to have to allocate for synchronously completing operations or even for very fast asynchronously completing ones. Those are the few places in the framework where we've done it. Now, as a result of something like, socket.read-write-async, there's also network stream read-write-async. And so memory stream where it's always going to complete asynchronously. And so when we expose the new methods on stream, because there are a bunch of streams, memory stream, buffered stream, network stream, and so on, where it can do something special in its implementation, we have those virtual methods returning value task and value task of T, even though most implementations aren't getting the full benefit of it.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, well, based on that, I think I'm just going to return task of T then, our task for the other ones, and I guess we can take it offline, Stephen, if I have any questions on that.
Yep, I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, unless there's any other questions, I'll move on to the options class, and if you can see it.
I have other questions.
Okay.
So for the overloads that take stream, what are the encoding behaviors of those?
Encoding for what? I mean, basically they're just wrappers on top of the existing, APIs that return byte and encode using the reader or writer.
Okay, so if I give you a stream and say to write the JSON to it, what encoding is it going to write bytes to for the stream? Is that specified in the options, or where is that specified?
You mean, is it going to write bytes or something else? Is that
like what encoding are the bytes in?
These should all be UTF-8.
Okay, so what do I do if the HTTP request that I'm running inside of specifies the encoding that they want to receive the response in?
In that case, what you would have to do is you would probably want to either write to a byte stream you would probably want to write to a temporary stream or to a string and then transcode to whatever encoding they actually wanted.
I mean, you could write to a stream that is a transcoding stream that just writes to the underlying stream. But
This would be more common on the inbound than outbound, right?
Do you have stats on how common it is for non-UTF-8 requests or responses?
No. Chris might know more, but I don't.
Something we stats, no, but on the inbound, it's not in the server's control. The client can specify anything they want, and we may or may not accept it. Mm-hmm. On the outbound, it's in the app's control, and everything defaults to UTF-8.
It defaults to, well, for us, it defaults to what the content encoding specified by the request is, because the client can ask for what encoding they want.
We only honor that within a certain range, though.
Sure, and I guess maybe asking for stats wasn't the right thing, but if you have a, like if your gut tells you that this isn't going to be very common, then it might just be that you can take the hit of doing an extra transcoding at the end before you either read or write.
Yeah, so I guess that's a reasonable point. So in the other APIs where we've taken the bytes, because we don't have char8 yet, we've named the parameter with UTF-8 in it to indicate the reading encoding. And I don't know if we would need the writes to be write UTF-8, except for the string one, which writes string. But we do, it is important to put the encoding in there somewhere. So JSON serializer dot read with read-only span of byte UTF-8 JSON.
What if it's in the options class instead?
So in the options class adds another sort of layer to it, which is do we have a perf penalty for providing you a different options class every time we call you, a different instance? Do we have to build a caching system for caching a set of options per coding? Users also like to mess, from my point of view at least, like, and for context, anybody who doesn't know me, I'm talking about, web frameworks, ASP.NET, those kind of scenarios. Users like to mess with the options. So users need to be able to mess with the options. So if the encoding is part of the options, that kind of crosses the stream a little bit because it's got stuff that the user cares about setting up mixed with per request information that has to be dynamically computed.
So, I mean, the problem right now is the JSON writer only understands how to write UTF-8. So adding in the converter option, the notion that it's going to transcode means that we're adding non-native transcoding because all the .NET APIs go to and from UTF-16. So I wouldn't put it in the converter options. If we're going, like, we should make that cost of work visible by putting UTF-8 in the API name and pushing it up to the caller. Then they may come back and ask us for better features, but right now we shouldn't hide it in the options.
Yeah, so I mean, we could either add it to the method name or we can add it to the static class, right? And have different methods. I mean,
that's true. If it's UTF-8 JSON serializer, then that hid the UTF-8 or put the UTF-8ness in the type name, which is why the JSON reader gets different treatment than other things.
Yeah, to Ryan's point though, like I think if users want to control that, I think it just means that we just push the thing out to a higher level API, right? It would just be at that point, Web API would have a way to configure that, and then you can say, well, whatever you want the default to be and whatever you want the native encoding to be, right? It just wouldn't go on that type. Like, in other words, I don't see a reason why the options themselves have to have the encoding in it. It's just a possible design choice.
Yeah, and I think if the options have the coding, it could be kind of confusing. Like if you pass in a string around and you specify UTF-8, what does that mean?
Okay, sure, that's fair. It was just a suggestion. That's all.
Yeah, but your suggestion did open up the point that we are appending UTF-8 to like the reader and the writer. And Jeremy, is it on the document too?
The document is not, and so the document's parse where it's reading bytes. It says that it's reading UTF-8 JSON. The document, is easier to extend to UTF-16 than the reader and writer are. So
Okay.
it doesn't talk about its encoding because you're not allowed to know about it. Aside from in the parse method, which is where they're named in the parameters.
Okay. And you have a parameter that's like a bool then, or what does it take to specify?
The name of the thing that takes read-only span of bytes, the name of that parameter is UTF-8 JSON.
Okay. Then just the name of the parameter. Okay.
So if we want to keep this type as extensible into other encodings in the future, then that would mean that we would take the writes that write to the pipe writer in the stream, and they would be called write UTF-8. And again, the workarounds right now, based on the fact that our system text encoding model is to and from UTF-16, unless we wanted to do double encoding on everything, the easiest workaround for like ASP.NET would be to make a UTF-8 to whatever encoding stream that just does piecemeal transcoding into the underlying stream. I'm not saying it's great, but that would be the easiest extension model.
Okay, so at a minimum, I'm hearing that we should add UTF-8 to the end of the async methods, or in the middle somewhere, right? UTF-8 async.
Yep.
And that's probably sufficient for now.
And put UTF-8 in the parameter names for the inputs to read.
Right.
Aside from string.
Okay. Well, except for string, probably. So UTF-8 JSON data, for example, would be a parameter name.
Or just UTF-8 JSON.
Okay, I'll take another stab at this, and then you guys can take a look at it and verify that then.
Does anybody have opinions on the last two, if the value should be first and the writer second, or if it's good the way it is?
Yeah, it was that way originally because of the extension method, so remove that, and we could flip it.
Yeah, I'm just not sure which way I would want it to be as a caller. Both ways seem weird. So. All right, no one has opinion, so it's fine as is.
No, I think the object should go first, then the writer. Because source, destination.
I'll second that. Thank you, Aslan.
Okay, so object value first. And then the writer or reader, okay.
So the ones that just take object, like 2JSON and 2JSON string, should they also take a type? What happens if the object is null? Does it matter?
Null is a valid JSON object.
So what we did in MVC model binding way back when was we actually have a lot of our APIs take T instead of just object. And the reason for that is if your model inside your code is typed as T model, but the actual object that you're passing in is a derived type, you probably intended to serialize just the model properties and not the stuff hanging off of the derived type. There are exceptions, but that's a decision that we made a long time ago. It may have changed since then.
Sorry, I'm not following. You're saying you wanted to serialize the derived one only?
No, so back when I was working on full framework MVC, and again, Core may have changed this, we had scenarios where inside your method, you might have your model typed as T model. Let's just say your model is typed as person. But when it comes back from your database, it might be derived person or manager or something like that. But you don't care about that because you're working very specifically with person. And that's all you wanted to serialize and deserialize. Again, like someone like Ryan would be able to talk more about that, if that's even a concern you still.
I mean that would be like breaking the inheritance hierarchy, though. If you don't serialize the type that's actually runtime, runtime.get type.
Yes, but your goal here is not to have full fidelity of the type on the other side.
Okay, that seems like a niche feature, in my opinion.
Well, niche or not, the question is just like, should we explicitly take a type so that the user can still say, object.getType if they really want to have the runtime type, or they can specify another one. Right now, you wouldn't be able to, right? You would always serialize the runtime type.
It wasn't a niche feature from the perspective of people were at the time used to using their database entity models, and they would sometimes have properties or fields that were only relevant to the database layer. Like what happens if the type is internal, for instance, and there are public properties on it? Are you going to serialize those or not?
So yeah, I guess it gets down to the POCO thing, purposely try to avoid inheritance hierarchies like this.
Yeah, if you're using just POCOs, like everything is fine. It's just what we observed way back when was in practice that almost never happens, unfortunately.
So I can confirm that we do still do this with JSON.NET. The place where this is really important in practice is with the XML serializers, because the XML serializers care a bit more. But with JSON.NET, we do pass the type of the object. And it's based on the return type of the method. So the point is that the existing feature set we have, the user does have control over specifying what type it should be serialized as.
Okay, I vote to defer this.
Yeah. So my other question to Ryan is, do you guys
add another method later if we want?
Do you guys have a preference for type versus generic? Both? Either?
So from my point of view, we can't use generics because we can never write the type name of something the user gave us. It's never static from our point of view. So generics, I think the generic things that are there have their own purpose, but I specifically asked for the object overloads to most of these things previously because we never have a generic type we can use.
Right.
Yeah, I would do it as generic right, and then a non-generic right that takes the type, and then someone can pass in what they expect their type to be if they want full dynamic inheritance. Or we could even say null is whatever type object has.
Yeah, if you do pass in the type, we are going to instantiate that type, of course, on the from methods, right?
On the froms, it makes sense. The question is, does the right need a cap on how far down the hierarchy it should go?
Yeah, and I'm saying for that particular case, although it's a valid feature request, that I would like to scope that out for the moment.
Right, and I'm objecting to that. I'm saying make it generic right of T, and then add a right of T that takes the type, and then you can decide what happens if someone passes null, but we shouldn't keep the right as is because of the points that Levi and Ryan made.
Oh, we could add the type parameter in the future.
No, that's opening up a pit of failure.
But I mean, then it's also
simplest overload is not what the simplest overload is not the safest, so we shouldn't add it.
Well, I mean, then you'd be forced to pass value.getType every time.
Or you could say that null is that you'll read value.getType.
Okay, but in either case, it's a feature ask, and that's why I'm asking to defer it.
Right, but this is your current design has raised a security point, so your current design fails security, so you need to change it.
Okay, I don't think it's a security point.
So I will say the reason we made this change in the first place in MVC was for security reasons.
I mean, there's other security hooks that we need for like writing to well-known types and etc. But
sure, and some of this too will just be considering and documenting, like, again, what happens if someone passes you a type where the type itself is marked as internal, but it has things like public properties. Like, do those get serialized out? Is that intentional? Those are just considerations we'll have to make.
Right.
Okay, I'm just going to keep this as an issue, and I guess I'll take it offline because I don't. You could say any feature you ask is a security feature, then you need it. I mean, that doesn't make sense. If you have a particular feature ask that needs to trim the inheritance hierarchy because this is a security issue, that's the same as feature ask for me as saying I just want to turn the inheritance hierarchy.
Sure, that and that's a fair point, and I don't think it's that we're trying to be intentionally difficult here. It's just looking at how stuff like this has been used in the past has kind of made us all a bit wary.
And I said we can add the type parameter later.
Yeah.
That's easier than passing in a null when you don't care.
We can also take this offline too.
Yeah, let's take it offline. Yeah.
All right, so I think that.
So if we can move forward to the next section, please.
Yep, I'm scrolling.
Okay, so the JSON converter options class, as you saw above, is passed in optionally on every method. Other serializers take different approaches. For example, you would new up your serializer class, which would have the methods on it and the options. I just took the approach here of passing them in separately. Part of the design revolves around hopefully you don't have to pass this thing in and have to cache it, and maybe different users have different settings, etc. So there's a lot of support for design time attributes, so that in theory you shouldn't have to use this. There's some environment options that you might want to specify, like max depth and stack depth, things like that you wouldn't want to put in an attribute. But in either case, I think one of the goals is that hopefully for the 90% case or 80% case, you probably don't need to pass this thing in. So although they come later, there's some attributes that you can. Well, where am I going here? All the design time. Okay, so there's various attributes that you can add at design time, and there's a mechanism to add that at runtime. I got some feedback that's somewhat unconventional, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, I'll keep going here. The add. Okay, yeah, scroll down a little bit more. There's just some detail here. You can read it off to the side, and I'll just start talking about some of the APIs. Okay. So the constructor, I added a way to disable the design time attributes. I did get some feedback that says, hey, how expensive is that? Yeah, you can amortize it over, thousands of calls, whatever. But if you don't want the extra hit, or you want to completely override all of the design time attributes, you can, there's an option to do that. That's what the disable design time attributes parameter is for. The class materializer property, this was optional. I kept it here because this is also based on feedback and some issues with other serializers. Is that we try to default to the most high performance implementation, which is currently reflection emit. It's not available everywhere, and unfortunately today there's not actually even a good way to ask if the current environment supports that. And I do link to an issue that might help with that. And primarily because of that is that we didn't really know in all situations whether the current environment supports reflection emit. It gives you a way to say, hey, I don't want to use reflection emit because it's going to blow up. So currently that's what that's for. In theory, that could go away, maybe based on feedback, maybe based upon this other issue, but currently it's in. Okay, default buffer size, max depth, reader options, and writer. Okay, default buffer size is used internally to help us create the initial buffer size. By default is -1, which indicates we're going to pick a size, which is currently 16K. You can set it to whatever value you want, greater than 0, or you can set it back to -1. Okay, so the next three, max depth, reader, and writer options, these basically flow down to the JSON reader or writer. And I have a review note here that, we could expose reader options and writer options as we have them. They're structs. So it's a little weird to have get and sets on them maybe, because people can get mixed up with properties on structs. So I'm thinking of just flattening everything out. But since the current prototype does it this way, I just left it.
So JSON reader options and JSON writer options are structs that are mutable or structs that are read only?
Hassan, you want to reply?
I mean, we can just check quickly. I think they are. Yeah, they are mutable. So I think when you try to do that, though, if a user of your type says, JSON converter options dot reader options dot comment handling equals something, you will get a compile error.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of flattening those out, but then that means we have to also extend this whenever there's a new option.
Yeah, that's why I would say I wouldn't flatten them out. It just means that if you do something, the naive a.b.c equals blah, you just get a compile error. But then people can just easily create a local variable, reader options, set it to whatever they want, and then just assign the property. That's better than us having to duplicate the API surface every single time we add something. We have to do it in 2 places.
I agree with you, Mo.
Okay, and then max depth is not something easily available. It's only used in the JSON reader state, which is what you need to use when you do async, but it's not currently on the reader or writer option, although maybe it could be, but right now it's not. So, it's okay. So I'll leave that as is for now. I'm going to skip the next part for now, the serialize and deserialize and case insensitive. I'll come back to that later. So the add attribute methods here, as I mentioned, that you can specify design time attributes, and basically this allows you to say, hey, if I can't use design time attributes because I don't know, I generate the type at runtime, they're not my types, or whatever reason, I have to change the values at runtime because I need to reuse the same type in different scenarios. Anyway, this allows you to basically override the design time attributes by passing in an attribute. So you basically new up an attribute and say, hey, it belongs to this type. And that's what the iCustom attribute provider is. And there's also an overload here that doesn't take the type. And this would be, and I recently added this based on feedback, that this would be a global setting that is not tied to a type or a property. Or an assembly. Right now, iCustom attribute provider can be an assembly, and there's some feedback if you read the discussion notes that push back on that says, hey, we probably don't really need attributes assigned to assembly. I mean, I'm open on that, but I think there are some decent scenarios for that. Okay, then finally, the get attributes method here allows you to see what you added, including design time, to see what the system is using. It could be used by custom converters to see if attributes exist and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so what you did here with add attribute and get attributes is effectively you duplicated some of the functionality that reflection gives you already out of the box. So there is this feature, I mean, it's not very well known, but basically your scenario here where you want to say, well, I would like reflection to pretend that this particular type or this particular API has this particular set of attributes. Is something that we actually have a way to do that. It's the whole reflection context thing where you can say, well, given this type, pretend that this method or this property has these attributes, or that this type has this attribute. So we might be better off, instead of doing this where you have add attributes and get attributes, you just you basically have an ability to say, specify the reflection context in which you want to reflect over the types. And then the consumer can effectively control every aspect of it.
All right. Yeah, I mean, you're correct that I'm trying to do the main thing I'm trying to do here is not provide duplicate classes for everything. So if you have an attribute that allows you to specify, a different type of datetime converter, and you're familiar with that attribute, it's like, well, now I need to change it at runtime. I know what the design time attribute is, but now what do I do at runtime?
Right.
Do I have to have a different programming model for that? That's basically the intent. But yeah, I mean, it's unconventional, and this is what I ended up with in my own, prototyping. I guess this is the first API review, so.
Yeah, so I'm not. So as I said, like I don't think it's that unusual. I mean, like we have similar areas where we did this in the past, right? Where there was math or I think some of the data contextualization had similar constraints where you wanted you basically want to serialize something or you want to discover something, and then your programming model depends on the presence of attributes, and you want to
There's a
effectively
system.
register them.
Sorry, the system component model does this as well, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, I think
way
system
back.
component model is super heavyweight, right? And we wouldn't need that.
Right.
I think if we want to do that here, I mean, we should look into reflection context. I mean, reflection context is this thing that might be overkill for what you're trying to achieve here, but it feels like that might be what we want to do here.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. And then the last three properties here, I put here based upon feedback again, that, some of this add attribute stuff is just like, what, okay, I have to add an attribute to change something simple like serialized null values, so the feedback was, it's not very easy because there is an attribute called JSON property attribute that you can put on a type, for example, to say serialize, but it's not very discoverable.
Right.
So these got lifted up, I guess you can say, to here. It affects performance a tiny bit now because now I have to check, basically two places at runtime, figure out what to do. But this is one approach, at least for those properties on JSON property attribute. There's other things like, hey, I want to register a new converter. Right now, you'd have to use add attribute. I didn't try to lift up any other helper methods or anything like that. But for now, I did put these three properties, which are the only three properties currently on JSON property attribute that we'll get to in a little bit. But there's probably going to be 10 to 20 here. So it's a, I think an important discussion that we have to have
Right.
on discoverability versus duplication of APIs, or having, bifurcation of programming model.
Yeah, so Steve, I have one question. So if you look at the Hello World sample code, is the expectation that a Hello World, POCO that I have to serialize or deserialize, I have to put at least one attribute somewhere, or can you literally just have a plain POCO, no attributes, and you're able to handle that?
Yeah. The default is you don't need any attributes, unlike System XML, which required you put data member and everything. Yeah, so the default is what all of the normal serializers do, except for some of the odd ones that are either super high performance and they need more information, or System XML. So yeah, it's POCO plain old object. You don't need any attributes. By default, we don't serialize null values, and we have case sensitive. So all of these, for example, the bool ones here are false by default.
Yeah, in that case, I don't think they're duplication, right? Because basically this allows you to do POCO with, reasonable global control without having to splinter a bunch of attributes over your type just because you don't want to serialize null values, right? Or because you want to serialize them.
The alternative, let's say I don't have these properties here, these three properties, because there is this attribute called JSON property attribute that if you don't want to put it on your POCO type, that's fine. You would have to pass that in at runtime to add attribute. And I guess that was the, this discoverability, I guess, for these common properties.
I see.
Or that you might want. So you can still call add attribute, pass in the class you want to apply these to, and then pass in an instance of JSON property attribute with, these whatever values you want to be applied set to some non-null value.
Yeah, I guess the question, and that's something that I don't know the answer to, is how common are these? Is this common that you want to control these things on a per type basis, or is this generally something you want to do on a global basis?
I think 90% of the time, global is fine. It's just if you're using other people's types, maybe, or maybe for multiple people, that things get a little goofy, or if you try to share the same options class, for example, because the options class, an instance of it, will contain this state on it as well as any attributes you added. So if you try to use that same instance of the options class with other random type POCO types that you have, and they have different semantics, then yeah, you run into some issues.
Right.
I would say that the case insensitive property name is probably going to be something that ASP.NET is going to set to true. And also, although it's not shown on here, there's a camel casing flag that our attribute. Camel casing is handled a little different than just a simple bool or here. So so there are a couple options I think that we optimize kind of for JSON syntax or schema. Like, okay, first of all, you don't probably have case insensitive property names by default because number one, JSON is case sensitive, and number two, it takes a little bit more time to do that. So we default to false. Camel casing, same thing by default. You know, we will use whatever value you have, which is normally Pascal case, but it's pretty common that you want the JSON to be camel cased. So there are a couple options I think that half of the users will probably want to set. 50%, you know, 50% of the types out there will probably want either through design time or runtime change some of the semantics. If they care about these things, and I'm just saying 50% because that sounds like I can't be right or wrong.
And case insensitive property name controls when you deserialize whether you map them sensitive or case insensitive?
Yeah, so JSON.NET right now is case insensitive, so the casing doesn't matter. That also means you can't have property uppercase A and property lowercase a in the same type.
I see. Which remind me again, is valid JSON or not valid JSON?
JSON by default is case sensitive.
Okay. And they allow duplication, just the differing by case?
Well, JSON as a schema or as, you know, standard doesn't care. I mean, you can do whatever you want, right? I mean, it's regarding the input coming in and mapping it to your object. But JSON.NET is case insensitive by default. So this would be true by default. I'm proposing that it'd be false.
I see.
For, like I said, for performance and because JSON standard is case sensitive. But that's open for discussion. Like I said, it's the first API review, and I didn't.
Why are these bools nullable?
If they're not set, then if they're set some other way through design time attributes, then that will get picked up instead.
I see.
It matches the JSON property attribute. If you look on there, they're also nullable. And it's like, hey, if it's nullable, then there's a default unless it's overridden as some other way.
So in other words, if I set it, then whatever I set it to will override whatever the attributes are?
In this case, because it's on this options class, yes. And actually, that's a good point. I need to write up a description on that override because attributes can be overridden. Like an attribute on a property would override the same attribute on a class. But how it applies that to this instance of this options class?
That seems odd to me because I would generally assume that the more local the setting, the higher the precedence. In other words, like I would expect the property on a type to generally take precedence over a global setting. Because otherwise, like, how do you?
Okay, sorry, yeah, you're right. You're right. In that case, I was thinking of right. No, you're right. And I do talk about that later on, but I don't talk about it applying to this options. But yes, this would only, like I said earlier, that it's nullable because unless it's overridden at a lower level, you're gonna. If by setting it here, it defaults if it's not already there.
Yeah, like I mean, if you have a default behavior, then why would you have to make it nullable? Because you can just say the default behavior is either true or false, and then unless you specify the type, then like unless you specify an attribute on the type, that's the default that counts. And if you do specify something on the type, well, then that's the one that counts.
I think what I was thinking of when I said that was that the add attribute method here, the runtime versions, will override the design times versions if everything is equal. So if you have an attribute that says serialize null values in design time, false, and then you change it to true at runtime, the runtime value is used instead of the design time value.
Yeah, that would make sense to me. I would expect runtime to take precedence over static attributes for sure.
Yeah, so there's two layers. There's hierarchy, and then there's runtime versus design time.
Right. Yeah, but which still now means I'm still confused why these things are nullable. Like when would you ever use the null value?
Well, it's just nullable by default. So if it's nullable by default, oh, you mean, yeah, they could be, but then the value might not be able to be calculated. So if you ask for it, here, I guess I would have to make sure the value is set properly.
Yeah, but you do have a behavior, right? I mean, let's say serialized null values is set to null initially, and then you're serializing a type. You have to make a decision whether you go with true or with false, right? And that one is either like if there's no attribute on the type, what's the behavior I'm getting? Because that's probably the behavior that this thing should be when you instantiate the converter options type, right?
Yeah. After thinking about it for a minute here, they could be non-nullable. It's just like I said, mapping what's on the JSON property attribute, which are nullable because there's 12 settings on them, for example, and you might only want to change one setting.
Yeah.
So that's why they're nullable on the attribute classes. But I guess since this is the highest level, that they do not have to be nullable, but yeah, they don't have to be nullable here. If we want to keep them here, and that's I guess why I have this design note, is that they're here for usability, but in theory, there's an alternate mechanism through add attribute that you can specify these. But I think, I've lifted them up based upon feedback, which I agree with, that is confusing to, for the simple cases, not to have these easily accessible.
So the comment.
So by the way, you call these serialized null values and deserialized null values. I don't think we use that term anywhere else. So what does serialized and deserialized mean in this context compared to the top level APIs?
Okay, serialized null values means if you have an object or a property that's null, we'll write the null out. And for deserialized, it's the same thing. By default, if an object or data is coming in and is null, we go through the extra work of setting the property null.
Should we then call these read null values and write null values?
Well, they're reading, they're affecting the object, I guess. If you refer to read and write on an object, I'm getting some echo, sorry. So yeah, we can so terminology. Yeah, this is applying to. So okay, so instead of serialized null values, we could say write null values, and deserialized we could say apply null values maybe.
To slightly back up regarding the nullability of these properties, the comment says that these override the attribute. Is that not true?
They only override if they're null.
You mean none?
If the properties on JSON property attributes are null, then they will override.
So they don't override. They provide.
Well, no, I mean they override the default. I guess there's a default. If you don't specify anything. So I didn't do XML doc yet, but yeah.
Okay, so if these are the get value or default value, then I agree that they should not be nullable. If they are, this wins, even if there's an attribute, then nullable makes sense.
Right.
Whichever one they're going to be.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so back to Aslam's feedback. Yeah, so terminology. Yeah, I'm fine with changing it. It's not quite read and write though, because I guess for reading the null values, we just don't set the property, right? So does read null values sound better than deserialize null values? Now, JSON.NET does call it null value handling, and they have an option here. But
So yeah,
So is the concern on deserialize that if a class's default constructor specified a property to be non-null, but you see the word null, it's asking whether you want to call the null on the setter for that property?
yeah, you don't. I mean, what's the do you want to override what's there? Or and also maybe you could argue a perf thing, especially when you're not using reflection emit. Setting a bunch of null values will, make your deserialization, I don't know, twice as slow if you got half values.
So, question related to that: wouldn't serialize null value and writer options go together, and deserialize null values and reader options go together? I.e., you don't want both at the same time, right? You never have serialize null value to be set some value and deserialize some null value to set some value.
Yep.
So there's a few things, I guess two of them, reader options, writer options, and these things that only apply for one side of the operation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I can see a library saving this object and using it on all their calls. Right. I was just wondering what the same default would be for the deserialized version, because if I have a class that instantiated a property, but the JSON explicitly had the word null in it, I would expect that property to be null. So I would think that one would be default to yes, and then the whether or not null should be written out, I would think that the current industry pattern would be to default to not writing the null.
Mm-hmm. I guess I took the approach of performance here on that. I do say that there is some confusion, or not confusion, but different people do different things. Sometimes null indicates the value is optional and just not specified instead of not being serialized altogether. So people do use the value of null in different ways. So I like I said, deserialize null values. Honestly, I agree with you, Jeremy, that it makes the most like object sense. If something's null in the JSON to set null, it's a performance tweak, I guess. But I mean, I could flip that.
So JSON.NET defaults both of those to true. And there is a difference semantically in JavaScript between a property missing and a property being null. So whether this is true or false has an effect in JavaScript. Like if someone is expecting middle name to come back as null and instead it's completely missing, that could affect how their program runs.
Versus like an empty string, you mean, or
no? Versus the property being completely missing.
Do you think this needs to have additional semantics around that then to handle that, or do you think just these two bools are sufficient?
I think the booleans are fine. I guess it's just what do you default them to? Like there are obviously pros and cons from each direction. I think most people would expect them to be true. But maybe that's my view is just based on what JSON.NET has been doing.
Yeah, I would expect the reader half to be true. The writer half, I would defer to James. So apparently they should both be true by default.
Yeah, again, I took the performance default here, which is, I guess, if you don't serialize the null values, you probably won't deserialize them. Number one, if you're doing both, and then of course decrease your payload if you have a lot of nulls, and then the same for the deserializes. Why set it if you don't have to? Normally, values are going to be null. Give me a new object.
Normally, but it is a bit unexpected.
And I guess this does open up an interesting design point is, regarding compatibility or even interop with JSON Net regarding, semantics here and defaults. How do we want to align? I mean, part of the goal here is to be fast. That doesn't mean I have to set every single property to be, the fastest default, because you can change some of those, you can change the defaults. But as far as interop with JSON Net, if we want to make that, I guess, a design point, which I did not list, then I think we need to be explicit about that somewhere in this document. Because I could probably look at other serializers and they have different, defaults for these. Not as commonly used, of course. But. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, like, for example, casing, and the other important one is the casing sensitivity, which, I talked about briefly already. Right now we have different default values for all three.
I think as long as there's the option to make case insensitive deserialization a thing, I think that's fine. Like I've had feedback with JSON.NET that people have wanted it to be case sensitive, and I think at some point I'll add that as a feature to have this flag. But obviously the default would be the reverse. But I think JSON.NET's unusual in that it does case insensitive property deserialization. Like everything else, like data contract serializer, is case sensitive. So I think in that case, JSON.NET's the odd way out, odd man out.
Yeah, for null value, I think that we should go with the principle of least surprise, which is why I think that deserialize should. If deserialize sees a null, your resultant hydrated object should have null, even if it had a default value in a constructor. And serialized null, I don't have a strong opinion about, but if you think they should match, then that means they should both be true by default. And if you want to reduce your payload size, you'll say false for serialized null.
So for
I think every other serializer will serialize null by default, like XML serializer will and data contract serializer will. I think if we're being consistent with other serializers, serialize and deserialize null values would both be true, and case insensitive would be false.
Honestly, I care much less about the consistency of other serializers. I would care more about what would we expect a web server to do by default, because I think, given that we try to position this thing as the built-in for ASP.NET serializer, I think it would be good to have a default that we can think like a web server making sense. And I would think that if you have an object where lots and lots of stuff is null, that by default you don't want to serialize that because it's just that way. Especially because if you assume most of the usage will be with POCO objects, but they will not have complicated policy, null just means don't bother, right?
Well, so the only time that I believe that actually matters in practice is if you have a patch operation, which I don't think is all that common. So.
Well, like, I mean, I would just say, like, in terms of payload reduction, it would matter, right?
Yeah. So I guess you still need the ability for someone to specify that, right? So the scenario is I'm patching a model on my web server, and I really, really, really do want you to overwrite these very particular properties with null.
Right.
But that is an uncommon case. Yeah, I'll admit that.
Yeah, I think if somebody goes to the trouble of setting it to null, I mean, the server knows what you're deserializing, right? If you know that you deserialize a POCO, you know that it's basically doing nothing, right? If you actually have a domain object where you have a constructor of some policy, well, then maybe you want to turn it on and say, well, if the caller went through the trouble of passing me a null, then maybe I should set it. But I think the question is, like, what is a reasonable default, right? And I think for serializing, it's probably going to be false, would be my guess. And for deserialization, I think it's probably also for POCUS at least, ignore effectively.
Well, another implementation you can look at for how JSON serialization happens is inside browsers. Like what happens when you do JSON.stringify and JSON.parse, and in both of those cases, those will write null values and set null values.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to think of the Stack Overflow question. Why, when I read this thing and I wrote null in the JSON, is it not null coming out of the serializer by default? And so I'm just arguing least surprise. And and so then consistency with other serializers, consistency with the browsers. It sounds like they should both be true by default. And if you want to do payload count,
I mean, I would side for payload size reduction as by default, because it's not like we are removing the option altogether, right?
Well, you could look at it from the other direction. Like if someone cares about payload size, then they just set a couple of properties and they're done.
Okay, that's fair. The question I had around deserialize, what does null mean, like true or false mean versus the property was missing? Like how does that map? Like the true false values versus the property that you want to deserialize that doesn't exist in the POCO object.
Oh, okay. So if the property doesn't exist, that's another feature that's pending. That would be in like an underflow case, how I've been referring to it as, which is a default value.
So this deserialized null values have no impact on missing properties one way or the other.
No.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so what I'm hearing two sides, right? I mean, I took the perf side. Assan's kind of taking the perf side. The other side is kind of like, okay, what is the least surprise? Maybe aligns better with other areas. Well, that serialize, deserialize, null. So I guess it goes back, and yeah, the option is there. Is okay. What do we expect by default? And I actually, I see both ways. I'm kind of leaning towards changing this to serialize and deserialize by default true, and then cases, keep it case sensitive, just to align better in other areas. And then of course we do take a perf hit, but if you see that in 99% of the cases where you see that, perf hit, you can probably flip these values around in your code will work just fine, right? Right.
I mean, that sounds good to me. My only point was it was a bit of failure because people might. The common case could be, I don't care about null values, and now you're forcing me to set this flag. Even if they're not for performance, about they really ignore. They don't want null values. So that's the question becomes like, what's the common scenario? Do people want null values in their output or they don't?
Yeah, honestly, my opinion is serialized null values should probably be false. I mean, that's what I would expect as a developer, and deserialize should probably be true. Like I said before, if you don't serialize null values, well, you're not going to come back again. At least if you control your own data, So I think that's fine, but setting them both to true might be the safer thing. It's not going to be by default the most performant thing, though.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing though is I was originally thinking the same way, but like as in serializing should be false and deserializing should be true. The only thing that is odd is that the only reason why you would care in that case is because you have a constructor that applies that applies some meaningful policy. And if that's the case, I think you generally want to serialize null values because they deviate from what your default state is. So in other words, they become
But
meaningful.
do we support constructors? Do we support constructors today?
Well, you can have a default constructor, right? That just sets it to some value.
Yeah, and I think there will be a need to have a deserialization callback mechanism so you can apply defaults after the object was deserialized as well, and maybe one before as well, before serialization. But that's in the future.
Yeah, basically, what I'm trying to get is that either nulls are meaningful or they are not. So in that case, you should either make them both basically, I think whatever default we do, they should both be the same. As soon as you deviate, I think you're creating somewhat of an odd world. So I feel much low. I think honestly, my gut feels I would make them both false by default, given our scenario, because I think probably if depending on how we go with this, but if we really push people down towards the POCO model, then I think there's no harm in making them false, and it's generally better for payload size. But if we feel like okay, people will do constructors with meaningful things, then I would say make them both true by default. I just think making them, one false, one true, I think would be probably breaking people at some point.
I can just change one to say don't deserialize, and then they can have the same value.
Yeah.
Yeah, like my feeling is just with all of James's consistency arguments, and then if somebody does do they initialize a value with a field initializer, just the questions that people would have when they get confused of I wrote null in the payload, or rather I see null in the payload, why is my value not null? That question to me just feels ridiculous, and I think that we should go for it said null be null is the default, and it said null I'm not going to call a setter is a perf improvement. And then once we've chosen that one, then the consistency with read and write says they should both be true, and case insensitive should be false.
I think I can be convinced of that. Yeah, I am okay with that.
Jeremy, can you repeat slowly what you just said?
So the limit is if somebody in a field initializer sets a value, but then the JSON says null, they would be confused why their value still had the default instead of being null.
Yes.
And so I think we should avoid the confusing state by default. That happens to match the consistency with our other serializers and with what the browser does with with the JSON type. And then by the read and write should have parity argument that you had, that means that serialized null value should also be true.
Okay, so you're basically saying the first two are true, and the third one would be false?
False.
Okay.
And I honestly think that's the correct thing to do. Again, it's just the perf, waving the perf flag by default, but I agree with that, with Jeremy's statement. So
yeah, I can live with that.
Okay, so I made a note of that. I'll document XML doc this the next time we review. Make sure that's clear.
And then with the materializer, maybe you said this earlier, but is it if someone says ref emit and ref emit's not available, you throw?
I didn't clarify that before. No. If you say ref emit, there's two things that can happen, I guess. One is if we if-diff our code out, depending on the platform you're on, yeah, it will throw, say, not supported. Right away, it'll throw. And then the other thing is, well, we'll give it a try, and then you might get a random exception, which happens today in certain cases, like in UWP, that it kind of works depending on what you're trying to do. And I don't know if it worked with this particular case or not right now.
Just to back up just a bit for max depth, it seems like you have one max depth, but the reader and writer have different max depth, maximums and semantics. There's two questions here. One is, should we have reader-specific max depth and writer-specific max depth? And second, should we change reader options and writer options to incorporate max depth so that you don't have to deal with this other serializer level?
Yeah, and the other question is, for my sake anyway, it would be convenient if max depth was just inside of those options.
Right. So as part of this takeaway, one of this could be that we incorporate max depth into reader and writer options so that they are unique and relevant only to them. Because right now, the way it is, like the user could say, I want to read max depth of 64, but then why would that apply to the writer when they didn't expect it to? Especially if these values are cached.
Yeah, I would. I mean, but the depth logically is or semantically is the same for the reader and the writer, isn't it? I mean, what it means. Like, how deep down the graph to go, for example.
Yes, but you might be willing to accept. You might be willing to write a more deeper payload than read, or vice versa. No.
I don't know. I think you'd want to do the same. That's why I have it like this. But I see what you're saying. I mean, since it is an option.
But I do think that's now the second or third time asked on that it's been asked why isn't max depth part of the option.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing I should definitely do is like include that into JSON reader options and writer options separately.
Yeah, and then that would just simplify this.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Okay, I guess we can keep going here. We got 4 minutes according to my schedule.
I've got a question about where you cache. Like I assume the first time you serialize a type, you build up a contract of it. So you reflect over the top of it, and then you cache that reflection somewhere. Is that cached against the options, or is it cached in a central place? And the reason I ask that is you have these add attribute methods on options.
No, that's a good question. By default, they're cached globally, a static variable, and once you start using these add options, then they're cached. The cache actually exists on the options instance. And I do mention that somewhere, some comments in here regarding that then it's important to preserve your instance of your options class and pass that around instead of newing one up every time, especially if you're doing this add attribute thing, because it definitely affects the cache, because things like a converter, for example, would be associated with a property, and if you're adding things at runtime, it's going to change what that cache value is. So it's in two places depending on if you use the add attribute or not.
Okay, so it's only, does that mean it's only important to cache the options if you use those add attribute methods?
Well, yeah, so originally I didn't have these other properties, these 3 properties for null value handling and things like that. Now, since I added them here, which are not reflected in my prototype, I have to reconsider that. And it may be that, if you set any of these properties or call any of the add attribute methods, then the cache will have to be associated with the instance and, not shared globally.
Right, okay. With JSON.NET, like a lot of those flags, like null value handling, that's handled at runtime. It's not baked into any generated IL or anything, and it's really the contract stuff is sort of constrained to the is it data contract resolver, I think, within JSON.NET, and that's the thing which has all the caching in it. So that allows people to new up JSON serializer settings and set those flags and not worry about it. While if you're going to be baking in these settings into the cache, which I guess might include generated IL, people would need to be really careful about caching converter options, because I can imagine people just newing up the converter options each time they want to call serialize, and they set serialize null values to false because they want to keep their payload size small. But what they're doing is they're recomputing all this reflection and IL generation every single serialization.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I do think in particular those 3 values, and there'll probably be more later, but it's possible, I can check the cached value and then compare against this and avoid having to, cache in those simple scenarios. But currently the code in the prototype does detect the call to add attribute and kind of flip a switch, store it locally.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to think about that, and whether I want to check in 2 places, I guess, to avoid caching for simple scenarios. Okay, I guess we're out of time. I'm sure some people have to leave. Emo, I mean, what, you schedule another one for next week, or?
Yeah, I think there's more stuff we need to go through, right? I mean, like, we should definitely talk about the attributes and the programming model that we think we will use on top. I think we got a decent amount of feedback for you. I don't know, like, do you want to take another iteration to revamp your proposal based on that, or do you want to rather finish it and then?
No, definitely. I want to update, the core API section so we can revisit that, and then hopefully that'll be quicker next time, and then we can hit some of this other stuff. And I do not have some everything in here. There's, like I said, there's pending features, and I'm not sure exactly what's going to fit in 3.0, but
Yeah.
What's in here right now is like the minimum viable product for X% of people, right?
All right, so then how about this? I think the only other person that picked me was Levi. Levi, you wanted to set up some more reviews for the UTF-8 stuff, right? Levi, are you still on? Or did you drop off? I guess he dropped off. Yeah, so then let me just set up another meeting. I guess next week will probably be a good time. And then, unless there's something scheduled, but I don't think there is. And then we can take it from there.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, online. And stay safe in the snow.